Fourth of our classes on Listen to What the Spirit Says. Again, looking primarily at the first three chapters of Revelation, but we've been doing some background studies that hopefully will be of interest and also help as we get into the text. So this evening, we're going to be looking at seven congregations in Asia. After looking at chapter 1 in our first session, I thought that there were several topics that could use some additional exploring to help us understand the background to what we're going to see in the seven letters recorded in chapters 2 and 3. There was the idea of letters, of correspondence in the first century, that this is going to be sent to congregations. That brought to my mind the idea of exploring how letters were sent in the first century without a postal system. And we explored that in our last lesson. That the cities were in Roman Asia brought the question, well, where was this? And who were the people who lived in this area? And that was in our second lesson. And that there were seven congregations in seven cities who had received letters brought a question to me. Why these cities? What's so special about them? So this is some of what we're going to examine in our time together this evening. So this is what I would like to look at in our class tonight. I want to look at this idea of seven representative cities and where that may have come from. Also look at the seven cities as a crossroads, particularly between Greek culture and then the Asian culture, if you will. Look at some of the people who lived in those seven cities, particularly the Jewish population and some of the pagan population. That will be fairly brief. And then just have a quick look as sort of an introduction to the letters to the seven congregations. So that's our plan for tonight. If any luck, I'll still finish at 9 o'clock, but we'll see how that goes. So we mentioned this in our first letter, that the order of the letters in Revelation 2 and 3 follow a particular order. But before I get to that, these letters in Revelation are not the only letters that were sent to this area. If you remember, Peter's first letter was sent to several Roman provinces in what is now Turkey. The opening verses of 1 Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the chosen exiles of the dispersion. And the dispersion was a phrase talking about Jews living outside of Israel. But the chosen exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, in holiness of the Spirit, for obedience and the sprinkling of the blood of Jesus Christ. Grace be to you, and may peace be multiplied. Notice there, 5 different Roman provinces. So 5 provinces mentioned there in 1 Peter 1. There is Pontus, and generally this is on the maps, you see it as Bithynia and Pontus. They seem to have been sort of somewhat together. There was Galatia. We're more familiar with that area through the letter to Galatians. Cappadocia, up in that area, you see it's spread out over a lot of the region of Turkey, and of course, Asia. And so Peter wrote to these. By the way, these are sort of listed in the reverse order that someone traveling from Rome would naturally deliver a letter. Apparently, from what I read, somebody going from Rome to deliver something into this area, they'd sort of take that route and dock there in Pontus, make the circuit, end up back in Bithynia, where there are plenty of harbors to get another ship if they're going back to Rome, if that was the origin of this letter. So the road would lead him to the leading cities of each province, where the local Christians there could deliver the letter to other congregations in their province. In this way, a letter such as First Peter could be very quickly dispersed amongst the Christian congregations. Get it to some main city areas, who could then send it on out to the others in their area. As I mentioned in our first lesson, the letters in Revelation 2 and 3 are in the natural order that someone delivering them in a circuit would do from the island of Patmos. So they would go in something like this. And once they get to Laodicea, they can make their way back to Ephesus along the valley there. And when we get to Laodicea, letter to Laodicea, we'll talk more about the road that was paved from Laodicea to Ephesus. But Roman roads had been built in this province of Asia around 130 BC. So they've been there for a while. But why 7 representative congregations? From the way this phrase is used, the 7 congregations in Asia, it would point to it as being a recognized and familiar phrase. We find that phrase 3 times in Revelation chapter 1. John to the 7 congregations in Asia. What you see, write in a book and send it to the 7 congregations: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. In verse 20, this is the mystery of the 7 stars which you saw on my right hand, and of the 7 golden lampstands. The 7 stars are the messengers of the 7 congregations. The 7 lampstands are the 7 congregations. So we keep having that 7, 7, 7. Now, if you know something about numerology, 7 stands for something that is complete. So 7 congregations then would be understood as standing for really all the communities, all the Christian communities in the province of Asia. But we might ask the question, I think it's a logical question, why not mention that it's written, that what was written was intended for all the other congregations? I liked what Ramsey said about that. I thought it was a reasonable statement. He said, in short, if there were not such a general agreement as to the representative character of the 7 churches, it's difficult to see how the writer could so entirely ignore the other churches and write to the 7 without a word of explanation that the letters were to be considered as referring also to the others. Paul, who wrote before that general agreement had been effected, carefully explained that his letter to Colossae was intended to be read also at Laodicea. We looked at that end of Colossians. And of course, the one at Laodicea was to be read in Colossae. John assumes that no explanation is needed. I think that's as good an explanation as any. Why 7? It represents all the congregations, but without an explanation because none's needed. It's just assumed if the writing goes to one, they will disperse it out to the others as well. It would seem that most, if not all, of the apostolic letters were copied and circulated to other Christian groups in the area. This is a map that's in the front of Ramsey's book, at least my copy from 1904. But notice that's the 7 congregations, the circuit there. But if you have really good eyesight, notice there's a lot of small dotted lines. Those are secondary roads. And he made a point of this. It wasn't that these 7 cities that this is sent to were the only cities to be passed through. Because if you notice on this route, there are quite a few other cities. There is Hierapolis, if you notice down there at the bottom right hand of the circuit. And then there's also an Antioch and Tralles and Magnesia, all important cities. So it wasn't that these were the only important cities, and it wasn't that they were the most important cities. There were a lot of important cities at this time. And it wasn't that the congregations in these cities were the most significant. Notice no mention in the 7 letters of Colossae. And Colossae, we know, was a major group of Christians there. Paul wrote to them. Ramsey suggested that the reason was that there was an established method of delivering correspondence to the congregations. And those 7 were the ones who would then disperse the correspondence to congregations in their area. And that very well could be the answer, that they already had this system set up where if one receives a letter, they make copies and send it to the others in their area. It would seem that the good news of Jesus had spread rapidly throughout Asia during the mid-first century and after, so that there was a congregation in every city, maybe even every town. So it's a fairly logical conclusion that they had an established way of communication with each other. Now, add to this that these 7 were the best points on the circuit to serve as centers of communication. Pergamum, and there's Pergamum up there, they could easily disperse along the known roads to other areas, including Troas and Adramyttium and Cyzicus and others on the coast there. Thyatira, well positioned for the inland, northeast and east. We've got Sardis there, and again, they're in a good position to take the message into the wide middle valley of the Hermus. Philadelphia is there, and Philadelphia very much for Upper Lydia. And we've got Laodicea, again, handling the Lycus Valley and central Phrygia without any problem. Ephesus, on the other side, the Caister and lower Meander valleys and coasts easily get to from there, and Smyrna for the lower Hermus Valley and the North Ionian coast. See, those 7, get a letter to those 7, and it's going to go throughout the whole area. It makes sense that when delivering letters, that possibly several messengers would be used. It'd be possible to use one messenger, but that would have been a bit slower, especially if he had to retrace his route at any point. If they used several messengers together when they needed to go to different cities, they could split up. The messages would arrive much quicker. Ramsey wrote, "Thus we find that the 7 letters are directed to a well-marked district embracing the greater part of the province Asia, and natural features along with indubitable epigraphic and monumental evidence makes it probable that the district of the 7 letters contained the entire Asian church." He can hit all the congregations by going to these 7. As we noted in our second lesson on the province of Asia, this population that lived here was the result of many migrations throughout history. Ramsey said some of them were old Anatolian cities like Pergamum and Sardis, but all these had recently experienced great changes, and many new cities like Laodicea, Philadelphia, Thyatira had been founded by the kings. And the kings that he's referencing there are the Greek kings, the Seleucid kings that came after Alexander the Great. The cities that they established were to help them organize and control the land they were ruling. They needed cities that were garrisons for their armies at the time, because if you remember from our second lesson, a lot of fighting going on in the Seleucid times. They needed centers as well of Greek education and philosophy so they could spread the Greek culture into these new lands. This type of society is referred to as Greco-Asiatic. Yes, they're establishing Greek culture, the Greco part in these cities, but they in turn were influenced by the Asian culture that was already there. Some of these new cities were expanded from what had been villages. Others were basically a refounding of existing cities. Usually they were given new names, although in some cases the old names survived, such as Ephesus, that's the old name, Troas, no, not Troas, Tarsus, which is not on this map. Also, uh, it retained its name. But the new names that showed up really reflected the Seleucid kings. Antioch was a popular one. Notice there's two Antiochs there on this map, and we know there are, I think, are up to 14 Antiochs named after the many Antiochuses. There was Laodicea. Who's Laodicea? She's the wife of one of the kings. So you want to name cities after her. And of course, Alexandria was a popular name, although not on this map, but named after Alexander the Great. The new population was established in these cities. Generally, people from other countries were brought in, which brought tension with the existing people. The immigrants were given property and privileges in the new cities, but that ensured their loyalty to the royal government who introduced them. There were others who benefited from the new royal policy, and these two groups were a powerful combination in the cities, although it was very much a bringing together two different cultures. This affected the seven cities in this way. Laodicea and also Thyatira up there were founded or refounded by the Seleucid kings. Ephesus, Smyrna, Troas, and Pergamum and Philadelphia were refounded by other Greek kings in the same time period. I believe that takes us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, almost all. Does it have Sardis? Almost all of the seven were refounds during this particular time period. Now, as they're establishing these new colonies, there were two types of people that were needed and encouraged to settle in these Seleucid colonies. As we mentioned, they needed soldiers. And soldiers, many of those were mercenaries, mainly from Macedonia and Thracia, and they made up the bulk of the Seleucid armies. They're described in not favorable terms. They were harsh, illiterate, selfish, domineering. The Greek writers of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC characterized them as braggarts, cowards at heart, boasting of false exploits. But the Greek kings knew then this is not what you want these new colonies to be dominated by, because soldiers aren't enough to establish permanent cities, especially if that was their characteristic. Yes, they were needed, but they need others who could manage and lead and organize and teach and create a commercial system. And these other people came from two main groups. They were the Greeks and they were Jews. These two groups were both familiar with Greek ideals. They were educated. They could think for themselves. They worked for a future. The Jews were educated in the Jewish scriptures, and as a result, they had a well-rounded education through their study of the Old Testament, as we would say. Then the Greeks were also there, and they were hard workers. They're educated, although they were not too enamored with their Seleucid rulers. Ramsay says, but settlers and kings alike had the common interest that they must dominate the uneducated mass of the ancient population. Thus, the constitution of the new cities was a compromise, sort of a limited monarchy, where democratic freedom and autocratic rule tempered and restrained each other. And the result was distinctly favorable to the development and prosperity of the cities. Although the Jews back in Israel were the enemies of the Seleucid kings, those living in foreign lands, the diaspora, were resigned to accept the government where he lived and found that being loyal brought benefits. Now, keep in mind from our second lesson that Jews had been transplanted into Asia during the early Seleucid kings, transplanted from Babylon. So there have been many generations of Jews living in this area, very much predating the Maccabean uprising that took place later on back in Israel. Now, add to this that because they were living by the Torah, they were regarded as different by those around them. They were very much aware that having royal favor kept them safe and kept their positions in society. And this also applied to the diaspora, the Jews outside of Israel, during Roman times. Although the Jews in Judea hated their Roman oppressors, the Jews through the Roman world were loyal subjects of the Roman Empire, had stood against those wanting to return to the old republic. The Jewish settlers provided a balance against the Greek colonists. From what I read, the Seleucid policy under the Greeks was when the Greek element became too strong, they'd move a bunch more Jews into the area to counterbalance that. It was this mixture of various people that gave the cities of Asia their unique blend of cultures and people under Greek rule. Immigration was encouraged. People were eager to move to these cities to engage in trade and business. They wanted to make money. The Seleucid kings gave them the fullest rights for living in those cities. Although they were reviewed by the native population as outsiders, the kings gave them citizenship, gave them a voice in the government, gave them influential positions in the cities. The Jews who had been brought by the Seleucid kings were spread through the great cities of the Greek world, especially those that were the centers of trade and finance. And the result of this mixtures of peoples stimulated rapid development of the cities. There was freedom to trade, which was a boon to any society. They had a settled and sound monetary system. There was a desire and eagerness, as well as the opportunity for everyone to make a profit. And there's also development education, as well as intellect. Although it was on a small scale, fairly short-lived, it was successful in bringing peoples of diverse backgrounds together for the benefit of all. Ramsey put it this way, keeping in mind he's writing the beginning of the 1900s. It was an experiment in a direction that is often theorized about and discussed at the present day. Can the East take on a Western character? Can the Asiatic be made like a European? In one sense, that is impossible. In another sense, it was done in the Greco-Asiatic cities and can be done again. It was done in them not by Europeanizing the Asiatic, but by profoundly modifying both. Each learned from the other. And that is the only treatment of the problem that can ever be successful. I notice I misspelled a number of words there in that quote from Ramsey. One of the best aspects of living in a Greek city was the emphasis on education and providing it for everyone, because that's very true in the Asian Greek cities as well. Education was provided to give children physical and mental training, and from what I read, to keep them from evil. They were devoted to learning, as were all who lived in the Greek culture during this time. Although some of that learning was a bit superficial, and some of it was a bit superstitious, unintelligent. In fact, we find some of that reflected in Paul's first letter to Timothy. If you remember, Paul had left Timothy in Ephesus. Ephesus, a city in Roman Asia. And he opens up that letter. He wrote to him and said, "As I left for Macedonia, I exhorted you to stay in Ephesus, that you might charge some not to teach a different doctrine, neither to pay attention to myths and endless genealogies. Such teachings bring about arguments, not God's plan and faith. The goal of the commandment is love, springing from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from a sincere faith. Some have deviated from these qualities, have strayed after empty talk. They want to be teachers of the law, but they do not understand what they're saying, nor the things of which they are so sure. That concern for myths and endless genealogies characterized what was going on in the education in this area. Not understanding what they're trying to teach shows how superficial their education was, and that was influencing the Christian community there. Ramsey wrote, the Christian letters need to be constantly illustrated from the life of those cities and to be always read in the light of a careful study of the society in them. It was, above all, the philosophical speculation in which they excelled and delighted that Paul detested. He saw serious danger in it. Not only was it useless and resultless in itself, mere empty deceit, as he wrote in Colossians 2:8, but far worse, it led directly to superstition. Keep in mind that many of the New Testament letters were written to Christians in these Greco-Asian Roman cities. Think about it. Ephesians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Philemon, and it would seem to an extent Galatians, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, of course, the 7 letters in Revelation. Now, what's of concern to us as we look at the spread of Christianity is that this was still largely what this area was still like even under Roman rule. The Romans didn't change much from what was there that the Greeks had put in place. Ramsey says, no more stimulating environment to the intellect can be found than was offered in the Greco-Asiatic cities. And the scanty glimpses which we get into the life of those cities revealed to us a very quick, restless, intelligent society, keenly interested in a rather empty and shallow kind of philosophic speculation, and almost utterly destitute of any vivifying and invigorating ideal. I don't know about you. I don't use the word vivify at all. So I looked it up. It means more lively and interesting. So the education they're getting, the philosophy, it's shallow and almost nothing lively and interesting in it. By the way, that's the environment that the Apostle Paul grew up in, living in Tarsus. That's the environment that the Apostle John learned through his long residence in Roman Asia. The good news of Jesus was the ideal solution for both the Jews and the pagans living in these cities. The Jews were given an even better way to live, especially as they began to sink more and more into a pagan lifestyle. We'll see some of that through the letters. And it gave pagans a better way of living by introducing the best of Jewish morality and even more by following Jesus. Now, there were still rivalries between the various cities. They all had a common language, that being Greek, and they had a veneer of Greek civilization, but they still had, which is from the Greek civilization, very much a loyalty to their city. Now, under Roman rule, they took the management of city business out of the city's hands, put it in the emperor's hands, and he appointed somebody to look out after it. So their civic pride then was shown in beautifying their cities. And there was a keen competition amongst these major cities of being the first of the province of or district. Smyrna said that it was the first of Asia in size and beauty. Ephesus said they were the first of Asia, as the embarking point of every Roman official was in Ephesus. Pergamum was first because it was the official capital. Sardis, on its coins, wrote the first metropolis of Asia, of Lydia, of Hellenism. And other provinces, other cities competed to be the most important. And so they had this rivalry going on as well. So this was the mixture of cultures, the Greeks, the Jews, the pagans. And we're going to find that coming through the letters to the seven congregations. Very much a collision of Jewish and Greek thought, as well as the native pagan populations. Jewish and Greek thought were mixed together more so in Roman Asia than anywhere else. There was the attempt of mixing together and harmonizing Jewish and Greek ideas. But the cities were prosperous. They were materially prosperous. They were intellectually prosperous. There was a very high degree of order and peace and prosperity. The thing is, when you get all of those things together, that can lead to moral deterioration, which we know ended up characterizing the Roman Empire. They had too much leisure time on their hands. What this area needed, as well as the Roman Empire as a whole, as well as cultures today, was the good news of Jesus. Let's take just a bit closer look at the population of Roman Asia, particularly the Jews who settled there and the pagans who became some of the early Christians. Ramsay wrote, the reasons which made them trusty, that's the Jews, trusty supporters of the Seleucid regime, and especially useful to counterbalance the Greek element in those cities, all the more trusty and useful because they were unpopular and even hated by their fellow citizens. Considering how important a part the Jewish Christians must have played in the Asian churches, it's necessary to examine their position in the cities more closely, and they will be mentioned time and again in these letters to the seven churches. The Jews in the cities and towns in Roman Asia looked with contempt on their pagan neighbors. Pagan people were very superstitious. Many Jews, though, exploited that by proclaiming a mixture of pagan and Jewish religious ideas and producing a type of magic and soothsaying, all to make a profit. Think of Elymas that Paul ran across on his first journey. Think of the seven sons of Sceva in Ephesus. You would have had in the cities very strict Jews trying to observe the law, all the way down to those who are trying to blend Jewish and pagan ideas. But despite all that, there was still a unity amongst the Jews, as they're still bound together by the Torah. They still attend the Sabbath assemblies each week for the weekly lessons, the weekly encouragement. Plus, they had the family Sabbath meals, of course, the annual Passover meal. So they were still bound together as a distinct community in all of this. Now, we don't have any records to establish how many Jews were in the Roman Asia cities. If you remember, as Antiochus III had moved 2,000 Jews from Babylonia into Lydia and Phrygia, and his policy was continued by other Seleucid kings. Cicero described how a Roman governor in 66 BC confiscated the half-shekel tax, which the Jews from this area were sending to Jerusalem. And the amount that he confiscated, I don't have the number, but it was quite a large sum, which shows a half-shekel tax. There was quite a large Jewish population in these areas. And through finding more documents and things through archaeology, we've discovered that many people who looked like ordinary Roman citizens were in fact part of the Jewish population. We also know that many Jews accepted Jesus and became Christians. And through this, they lost their distinctiveness as Jews. Many Jews had the status of resident aliens in these cities. It was fairly normal in Greek cities for people from outside the area to move in for trade, to conduct business, and to become permanent residents along with their families. But sometimes it was difficult for them to become citizens. They usually brought their own religion or religions with them, and they formed groups to worship together. And not only did the Jews do this, the pagans did this as well. There were numerous they were very numerous, and they were legal to do that. It was recognized by law and custom that when moving into an area, you could bring your religion with you. And that, by the way, included the Jews. And that's the way the foreign religions spread in the cities. Those which had impressive ceremonies attracted some of the less educated Greeks. When Jews moved into a city, they would begin meeting together on the Sabbath, whether at the side of a river, as they did in Philippi, or if there were enough, they would form and build their own synagogue. And they also attracted the local people. Some became proselytes, and others adhered to them because of the higher morality that was taught. But because they were different, especially through the way they lived, it also brought hatred from many of the local population. Ramsey said, similarly, the Jewish association with its synagogues or place of prayer by seashore or riverbank attracted attention and proselytes, though it repelled and roused the hatred of the majority because it was so strange and mysterious and incomprehensible to the ordinary pagan. With its proud isolation, its lofty morality, its superiority to pagan ideas in life, its unhesitating confidence in its superiority. Thus, the Jews became a power even where they ranked only as aliens. The Jews had influence, and there were quite a number of them. In some cities, the Jews had citizenship, particularly those cities that had been founded by the Seleucid kings. But that all led to animosity with other citizens. How could the Jews be equal citizens when they refused to worship the local city gods? If you remember, the organization of Greek cities was based around their religion. Being a Greek citizen was not when a Greek city was not based on individual citizens, but an association of various groups, which they called tribes. These tribes, though, were united by a common religious bond and worshipped a common deity or deities. So you'd have a bunch of these groups that they called tribes that would form together to form the population of a city. That allowed for Jews to be citizens because they were a group, a tribe, who were united by the worship of Yahweh. And that met the definition of a citizen grouping, despite the fact they rejected the local deities. Josephus mentioned some of this in his writings as well. In this way, Jews could be given citizenship in Greek cities, despite these cities being centers of Hellenistic civilization. Ramsey says the period of which we are treating the term Hellenes did not imply Greek blood and race, but only language and education and social manners. The Jews could never be in the strict sense Hellenes, for their manners and way of thinking were too diverse from the Greek. But by enrolling them in a tribe and giving this tribe a Greek name and outward appearance, the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kings made them members of a city of Hellenes. But that didn't get rid of the fact that the Jews refused to be involved in the uniting religion of the city. From the time of Seleucus on, they simply declared the Jews to be citizens and free to disregard the common city worship and religion. If any law or regulation conflicted with the Jewish religion, they didn't have to follow it. And other laws and regulations were modified to fit in with the Jewish beliefs. I read that when allowances of oil were given to the citizens, this royal law ordered that the Jews be given a cash equivalent instead, because they wouldn't use oil that a Gentile had handled or made. That brought animosity from their fellow citizens. Ramsey says it seemed to them an outrage that members of the city should despise and reject the gods of the city. This ranked in their minds a wound that could not be healed. To protect the Jewish citizens of a city, special rules had to be drawn up. These were to safeguard the special Jewish positions and rights. They could have no rights if it wasn't written into law, so they enacted laws. There's an inscription. This is not it. This is just an inscription. But there's an inscription in Apamea in Phrygia that's called the Law of the Jews. It protected the Jews. And that there was one in Apamea would imply that there were others in other cities as well. So one of the questions and clarifications that comes up in the New Testament writings is, who were the real Jews? I think Paul's explanation in Romans 11 is useful. He described Israel as a cultivated olive tree. The Gentiles, those who are not Jews, are from a wild olive tree. You remember this, the end of Romans 11. God removed the branches from the olive tree, the Jews who rejected Jesus, and grafted in the branches from the wild olive tree, the Gentiles. But notice that the tree is still Israel. By the way, New Testament never talks about New Israel. You won't find that in the pages of Scripture. It's Israel. And the Israel is what's changed by the branches being grafted in. That tells us that Christians are the true Jews. They're the true Israel. That's the same idea we find in Revelation. Christians were the true Jews. The national Jews who rejected Jesus and were trying to hold on to the Mosaic law were not the true Jews. And we're going to see the phrase when we get into these letters, that instead they were a synagogue of Satan. But we'll get to that in the coming weeks. There are also a group of Christians that did not come from a Jewish background, but had been pagans. There were those who had been first attached to local synagogue, often called God-fearers. They were acquainted with God, they were acquainted with the Jewish scriptures and the Sabbath assemblies as well as the Jewish way of life. But others became Christians directly after leaving their pagan gods and accepting Jesus. They had major changes to make in their lives, as can be seen in some of the early Christian writers, especially those who had come from this pagan background. Some of the things I read, a pagan would wear special clothing which identified what God they served. Obviously, if there's a Christian, they can't do that. What do Christians wear? They simply put on Christ. Pagans would carry images of their deity. Christians carried God and Jesus in their lives. Pagans would carry sacred objects. Christians carried holiness with them at all times. Some seem to have made these changes without problems. But, of course, what I left out there, pagans worship in special temples. Christians are the temple of God's Spirit. They had changes to make, changes in their way of thinking. Some made it without problem. Others struggled and tried to amalgamate some pagan practices with being a Christian. And this can be seen in Christian history in the centuries following the first century. And we're going to see some of this in the letters to the congregations as well. I think we can see how all of this would affect Christians as well. Keep in mind, the Jews were hated for their rejection of any other God and living differently than the usual population. But they had to be tolerated legally because they were a legal group. But now there's this new group on the scene, Christians, many of whom used to participate in the local religious observances, but now they won't because they're a Christian, and they're also rejected by the Jews. So the stage was set for some serious problems for Christians with the local populace. And we're going to see some of that in these letters. And that very well leads us to the 7 letters to the 7 congregations. As these were all together and formed the opening part of the book of Revelation, it suggests that they were designed to be sent together to all the congregations in Roman Asia, even though each of the 7 letters has a special character which reflects the individual cities. even though they're intended to be read much wider. We'll try to bring some of that out in the coming weeks. Ramsey says, to sum up and anticipate the results of that closer study, it may here be said that the author of the 7 letters, while composing them all on the same general lines as mere parts of an episode in a great work of literature, parts to them many touches, specially suitable to the individual churches, and shows his intimate knowledge of them all. And we're going to pick up there next week by beginning our study of each of the 7 letters. So I hope these background lessons have helped us to maybe get a feel for what life was like in Roman Asia, what it was like to live in first century Roman Asia, and some of the conditions the Christians were living through. And we're going to be going into a lot of this when we get into the letters themselves. So next week, we're going to look at the letter to Ephesus. So we're going to concentrate on the first 7 verses of Revelation 2. And yeah, I'll give you a walkthrough of what we've uncovered archaeologically in Ephesus and let you see some of it. There's a photo from it there as well. And then we'll do that for each of the cities as we get to them.